It's new tool day, but first we need to make room for the new by removing the old. This Craftsman served me well over the years, but I've outgrown it, and the time has come for it to be honorably retired. My new saw is this Dewalt 10-inch 15-amp Jobsite saw. Real estate is limited in the 1.5-car garage shop that doubles as my studio, so having a reputable saw that can collapse and be wheeled around with ease should be the perfect combination of value, utility, and space savings that I need. Let's check this thing out. Hey everyone, Tom the Dilettante here. Hope you're all doing well. Today I'd like to introduce you to my new Dewalt table saw. I'll share with you some of its features as I get it tuned up for its first use, take it for a few test cuts, and then share with you my overall impressions. Now this saw replaces my old Craftsman table saw, which you saw earlier, and that thing had served me well for a long time. And being the sentimental guy that I am, I couldn't help but make a short homage to it, which I'll post with this video or you can find up here. Let's get started. First thing I'm going to do is check the tabletop flatness using my straight edge. Now, there's not a whole lot we can do about it if it's not flat, but it should give us a good starting point to let us know what our baseline is. We'll start by running a light along the bottom of the straight edge and look for any gaps. Here we'll make note of a small gap in the front right part of the table. We'll repeat the process up and down the tabletop to check for overall flatness. We'll also do a preliminary check of the throat plate. Here you can see it's sitting low towards the front, and the plate sitting proud in the back, causing my flat bar to rock. Another way to do this check is to use some feeler gauges. Here I can test that I'm about 5 thousandths out at its max spot. Next we'll check corner to corner from each angle and call it a day. Alright, so overall, tabletop's pretty flat. It's got an overall deviation of about 10 thousandths of an inch from its highest to lowest spot, and to be honest, that's better than I've ever had. Next we'll check the throat plate at the front of the blade to make sure that it's level with or slightly beneath the tabletop. The rear of the throat plate is sitting proud, so we'll need to adjust it. To do this, we simply tighten or loosen the adjustment screws found at each corner of the plate. Check again to make sure we're flush, and one more check across the whole length of the plate before moving on. It's worth noting that even after adjusting, the plate has some play to it, both overall and in the back corner like it's slightly bent. I think that just means that one of our first projects is going to have to be a zero clearance plate. Now, since a lot of the next steps require indexing off the blade, we're going to take this opportunity to replace the factory blade with this Diablo general purpose wood blade. The throat plate comes off easy by just turning this lock, and we'll crank the blade all the way up to make it easier to work on. Grab the included wrenches conveniently stored by the cord, and get to loosening the nut off the factory blade. Be careful not to drop the nut or washer like I'm about to do. These factory blades really aren't all that, so I don't feel bad about just ditching it. The new blade goes in the same way the old one came out. Tighten it up nice and snug, and don't forget to make sure it's pointed in the right direction. Next, we're going to use a machinist square to check if the blade is parallel to the miter grooves, and if not, adjust it. We'll extend the rule until it makes contact with the flat face of the blade at either end, and slide it along the blade to check for consistent contact. Here you can see a gap developing as we go towards the back of the blade. I checked it from a couple angles, and yeah, this thing appears to be out of alignment. Alright, before investing a whole lot of time and energy into realigning this blade, let's corroborate our findings using another method. And so for that, I'm going to use this dial indicator that I've got affixed to a rail in my miter groove. We're going to do this a little different. As you can see here, I've made a reference mark on the blade, and we're going to take our measurements from that reference mark while it's at both the front and the rear. The reason we're doing it this way is because the deviation that we saw using the combination square might have had nothing to do with how the motor is aligned. It might have just been due to the blade being untrue. So with our gauge zeroed out, let's see what we get. So I'm showing about 14.5 thousandths further away from the gauge than it was at the front. Let's re-index it and make sure we still get the same reading. So in the same spot, we're zeroed out again. And we can replicate those results with the offset being at about 14.5 to 15 thousandths. While we're at it, let's go ahead and test blade run out. With the indicator zeroed out, we're going to go ahead and rotate it 360 degrees and see how much deviation we get. Alright, on that I saw a range of -5 thousandths to +3 thousandths, which means to me that we've got an overall run out of about 8 thousandths of an inch. And honestly, I don't know if that's good or bad. You let me know in the comments how you feel about it. To adjust the blade, we're going to loosen these two 4mm hex nuts that are at the back of the housing. With the housing loose, we're going to try to tap it into place using this rubber mallet. And as you recall, I need to come this way about 15 thousandths of an inch. Making micro adjustments in this way, then checking and rechecking the blade alignment to ensure I get accurate and repeatable results, took me a lot longer than I thought it would. But it was a worthwhile exercise to get this thing set up right. Okay, so it took a number of tries to get this right. Gentle tapping over to the direction that I needed seemed to have worked out well, but I kept constantly checking it, and what I learned is that I needed to overcorrect by about 4 to 4.5 thousandths of an inch because tightening those hex heads ended up sucking everything back by about that much. So here's the moment of truth. Let's see whether or not we're good to go. All right. Once again, we're on our mark. We're going to zero out our gauge, and we'll see if we're at the same plane at both ends of the blade. Success! So much better. Now, I won't lie, that took about 10 minutes to accomplish. So if you're going to do this, be prepared for a little bit of tedium. So with that done, now let's make sure that the riving knife is actually in line with our newly aligned blade. Fortunately, the riving knife looks pretty good to go here. I did take a straight edge to it, and I couldn't really find an appreciable difference, at least not enough to warrant an adjustment. The last thing that we're going to do with the blade is to make sure that the bevel stops are at a good 90 and 45 degrees. With the blade still raised all the way up, I'm going to use one of my better squares to see how we stand. Here you can see the light through a slight gap on the bottom, meaning that the blade is leaning towards me. Doing the check using a machinist square, I get the same results. And finally, I have this cheap digital angle finder, and it's also indicating that we're not quite 90 degrees. So we'll loosen the bevel stop and try to tap it into the right position. Once we get there, we'll tighten the bevel stop again. From there, we'll use a 4mm hex to relocate the bevel stop cam. Reset the stop indicator, and we're good to go. We'll repeat the same process to find a good 45. All right, we are finally done with the blade part. Now we can get to the fence. The fence is held in place conveniently by these two latches, one in front and one in the rear. Just undo them, tilt the fence down, and pull it off. First, we're going to check to make sure that the fence is square with the table. We'll use our square again and place it up against the fence at multiple points along the table. We're looking for any light between the square and the fence to show gaps that indicate if the fence isn't a perfect 90 degrees from the table. Here it looks like the top of the fence is leaning ever so slightly towards the blade. We'll corroborate that observation with another square, and it too seems to suggest the fence is just under 90 degrees, and not entirely flat. Now, according to others on YouTube, this particular adjustment is not something that can be made on this fence. Some have argued that you can take these screws out and place some shims behind the support and the fence and try to space it out just right, but others will say that it's easy to strip out these screws from this aluminum fence, and if you're going to do it, you should do so carefully. This is not that far off, I don't think, so I'm just going to leave it as is and move on to the next adjustment. Alright, the next check we're going to do is to make sure that the fence is in fact parallel with the miter grooves, which we now know are parallel with the blade. And for that, I'm going to show you how to do it using a square, and then again using my dial indicator. So using the square, we're going to put it in the groove as far over here as I can, and then move the fence until it just kisses the square itself. And move it along the groove to see if we see any gaps. Now it looks like there's a very small gap growing as I get this way, so I'm going to reset the fence starting on this end and go that way just in case I miss something. Yeah, it felt like the fence pushed the square ever so slightly away from the groove. So let's try the dial indicator next. I'm going to pop it in the groove, power it on, make sure she's in there nice and solid, zero it out, let's see what we got. Looks like it's about 6.5 thousandths as I made my way this way, and that would be that direction, so the gap got wider. Kind of like what we saw with the square. So the fence has 3 mounting positions on this saw, and so we're going to have to do this test for each one of those mounting positions. For this one, we need to take this front mount and shove it in ever so slightly by about 6.5 thou. To do that, we're just going to loosen up this 4mm hex and then adjust the fence. Alright, that puts us within 5/10 thousandths of an inch. I think we're good to go. Alright, that was a little tedious, but we got the job done. Each one of the 3 mounts is now set up so that the fence is parallel to the blade. We know that the blade is parallel to the miter grooves, so I think we're good to go. One thing I did notice though is that the fence itself is not exactly straight. As I was running the dial indicator along the length of the fence, I noticed about a 3 thousandths of an inch bow. and that's a bow towards the blade while the fence is in its usual position on the right-hand side of the blade. Now, I've made do with a lot worse, so I remain cautiously optimistic. Now we're just going to place the fence right up next to the blade and adjust the rip gauge. Alright, that wraps up setting up and tuning the saw, and we're finally ready to make our first cuts. The first cuts that we're going to make are going to be on a run-of-the-mill half-inch piece of plywood that we're just going to rip lengthwise to see how that works. And we'll run this 1-inch ash cutoff that I have from a table project a couple years ago through it to see how well it handles some hardwood. First, let's lower the blade down to an appropriate height for our half-inch plywood cut. And let's set the fence using the rip gauge at 18 inches to see how accurate this thing actually is. Lock the fence in place, and we're ready to rock. And this is going to be this saw's first cut. So to get going, we're going to put on our eyes and our ears because I am hitting that point in my life where both are starting to go. Let's fire it up. Did I say 18 inches? I meant 10. So there's the first lesson. This rip gauge has actually two sets of measurements. One on top is for this innermost mount, and then the one on the bottom is for the outermost mount because you get a longer rip. And so what I read as 18 is actually 10. But on the bright side, this thing is actually dead nuts on 10. So that rip gauge is going to be pretty handy. Let's readjust the blade and see how well it does on this nice little piece of ash. That came out really nice. And once again, pretty much spot on right where I wanted it, 5 inches in this case. And yes, I'm aware I should probably use a push block, but to be honest, I'm not quite sure where I put them. And honestly, I need new ones anyway. Alright, so far I'm pretty impressed with this saw. The startup and shutdown of the blade was much nicer than my old Craftsman, and it didn't even hesitate a bit going through this 1-inch piece of ash. As you can see here, the cut is really clean. I'm very happy with this cut. And then putting my square on this afterwards, this is a very nice 90-degree cut. So I think this is going to be an excellent replacement for my old Craftsman. Now, the reason I got rid of the old Craftsman is because you might have seen that it was built into a much larger table, and I had long since ditched the legs for it. And that table was just being unused. I had built that thing when I was doing my kitchen cabinets and tables and other big projects that I don't need anymore. So aside from that thing taking up too much space, I also wanted to downsize a little bit and get something a little bit more portable. All too often, I found myself trying to roll that big-ass saw out into my driveway or somewhere in order to do some work, when in reality, this thing, being able to just collapse like a wheelbarrow style, I think is going to be awesome. Speaking of which, let's break this thing down now so you can see what I'm talking about. And that's all there is to it. That's really awesome. Alright, let's wrap this up. We're going to talk about the overall experience of unboxing and setting this thing up, cover some likes and then some dislikes. So, unboxing it. The thing was actually very well packaged. No dents, scratches, or anything like that, and it went together quite nice. I really liked that all the hardware came in individual and labeled bags, and the instructions were pretty clear and intelligible, unlike, say, the diesel heater manual that I tried to decipher a couple years ago. The one thing I didn't like about it, though, is I don't think it came with enough washers. Maybe they weren't needed, but I just prefer using washers versus digging nuts and bolt heads into powder coat. So because of that shortcoming, I had to rummage through the shop to find enough washers, and after pretty much depleting my entire inventory of a particular size, I had enough to satisfy my OCD. Now when it comes to my likes and dislikes so far, take that with a grain of salt because I just got the thing and only fired it up once, so a year from now I might have a completely different list. But let's start off with the first like. The portability of it. I love the fact that this thing can just simply collapse and I can move it away wherever I want and take it out in the driveway, maybe even load it up in the back of the GX and whatnot. And it stores nicely in the shop without taking up a whole lot of space. Which is my second like, the fact that it has a very small footprint in the shop. And that could just be because my last table saw setup was about 7 feet long. This thing just tilts up and tucks away, and I'm good to go. The third like is the power of this thing, especially for its size. And this is relatively speaking. The Craftsman that I had was an underpowered dog, but it got the job done. But when you're going through some thick hardwood, you can definitely hear the motor start to strain and the RPM start to drop. This thing I didn't have any such issue, especially going through that piece of ash. Now, that same piece when I was doing a tabletop, my last saw definitely struggled. The next thing that I like about this thing is its adjustability. My last saw did not have hardly any adjustments. I usually had to work around things that were not quite true, right-angled, straight, or whatnot. This thing I was actually able to dial in most of the critical components in order to get it set up and tuned pretty decently. The fifth and last thing that I like about this thing is the fence. But the fence actually made it to both my like and my dislike side. So let me explain. On the like side, it's definitely a better quality fence than some of the other saws that I saw in its price range and category. It's quite rigid, it secures nicely, it adjusts well, it's got the adjustable rip gauge, which is quite handy for a quick reference, and it's got multiple locations that I can pin it on to one side on the left or two sides on the right. It also has this little drop down thing so that if I go off the tabletop, I can still support my work as I'm cutting it. That being said, we'll use this as a segue into my dislikes, and we'll start with the fence. The first thing about the fence that I dislike is that it's not the sturdiest thing. It's not bad, but it's not super sturdy. Now, keep in mind, the Craftsman's fence that I had in my last saw was deplorable, which is why when I built that big tabletop, I had augmented it with a $450 Vega fence. I don't know about you, but a fence is like a make or break thing on a table saw for me. And that Vega fence was just the bee's knees. It had micro adjustments, it was super rigid, super adjustable, and I was able to get a lot done with that fence and a piddly little saw. Heck, that fence cost about 4 times as much as the saw. Anyway, that's my only real complaint about the fence. It's a little unfortunate that I couldn't adjust it without maybe disassembling and shimming it, and the fact that it wasn't completely straight, but I'll take it for the price. Second dislike for this thing is really the miter gauge. I mean, it's not that bad, but it's really not that good. It's probably good enough to get the job done, but I'm definitely going to be buying a nicer miter gauge and building a crosscut sled and other things like that, and probably just putting that one to collect dust. My third dislike is something that I feel I should dislike, but I haven't been given any reason to dislike it yet, and that's the fact that the blade height adjustment doesn't have a lock. You crank the thing up and down, and that's just it. Hopefully it's not an issue, but if the blade height starts to drift on me when I'm trying to cut, say, dados or rabbits, I'm going to be pretty pissed, so I would have liked to have a blade height adjustment lock. The next two dislikes might be a little unfair given what this Jobsite saw was designed to do. The first one is going to be the lack of an outfeed table. Now, yeah, I can probably build one, but I'll tell you, the fence that I like with its dual adjustments on the front and the back is probably going to give me a bit of an issue because that guide and rail in the rear might make it a little difficult to mount an outfeed table. I'm sure it could be done, but it just might require a little bit more ingenuity. My last dislike is really more a reflection on me, and that's the dual measurements on the ripstop gauge. As you saw earlier in the video, that dual scale on the rip gauge might be a little confusing. Honestly, that was just me being dumb, and I certainly hope in the future I'm paying attention and I'll be able to tell when something's about 8 inches off. Well, that is it. Thank you for joining me on this one. What do you think of the saw? What do you think of the video? If you liked it, go ahead and give me a thumbs up. It'll help with the YouTube algorithm. Leave a comment, leave your questions below, and until the next time, this is Tom the Dilettante saying thank you for watching and have a good one. Take care. I've been trying to put this video together for about 2 months now. That's not how long it took to make the video, it's just, going off and on the project for a while. Anyway, if you've made it with me this long, thank you very much. As a reward, here are some outtakes. Cutting me a piece of ash, take 1. Now, according to some others on YouTube, this fence, this angle, this particular, what am I trying to say? This particular angle, this particular adjustment, perpendicular to the table, but they'll also say that these screws are easy to strip out, and I'm just talking like a fucking moron. Okay, let's try again. Yeah, it felt like the fence pushed this. Yeesh. All right. Apparently I need to tighten this thing down more because I'm getting play. That'll throw off your measurements, Tom. All right, that was a little tedious, but we got the job done. Each one of the stops for the fence, it's not a stop. What am I saying? What do I want to call that? It's a mount. It's a mount. And I did notice as I was doing that the blade is not exactly straight. The blade is straight, but the fucking fence isn't straight. If I can figure out my terminology, then I'd be good.